welcome to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center's An Afternoon with the Author. My name is Deidre Teagarden, and I'm thrilled that so many of you have joined us for this afternoon chat with Susan H. Kamei, who I will introduce in just a moment. For those of you who are new to the series, we love to take your questions, and there's a little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen. So feel free to jot your questions in as they come to you, and we will get to as many as time allows. Also, this is being recorded and will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel in about a week. So again, we encourage you to check out our YouTube channel for this and other talks you may have missed. And if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about our center, please visit us on the web at nvmc.org. Again, we are so thrilled to have all of you here with us today. And I'm so excited to have Susan Kamei on with us regarding her book, When Can We Go Back to America? Susan H. Kamei is recognized today as one of our country's most prominent and visible scholars on the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, and one whose work has significantly influenced the study of political, social, and Asian American history. Her book, When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II, published by Simon & Schuster in 2021, has received critical acclaim for its riveting, meticulously researched, and comprehensive historical narrative of this tragic episode in our nation's history. She has appeared in broadcasts by media outlets such as NPR, C-SPAN, France 24, and NBC. And her op-ed pieces and other articles have been published in the Los Angeles Times, The Conversation, and Discover Nikkei. She draws upon the stories of her incarcerated grandparents and parents and her experiences as a volunteer leader in the legislative campaign for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that acknowledged the wrongfulness of the incarceration and provided token reparation payments to surviving incarcerees. Professor Kamei created and teaches a popular USC undergraduate course on the incarceration and its constitutional and social implications today, the first of its kind to take a comprehensive and interdisciplinary approach to this complex subject. In recognition of her scholarship and contributions to USC, she received a 2022 USC Phi Kappa Phi Faculty Recognition Award and the USC Undergraduate Student Government 2018 Community Achievement Award. She lives in Pasadena, California, where she can be close to the Japanese American National Museum, Fugetsudo Manju, and all else that Little Tokyo has to offer. Please help me give a warm Maui virtual welcome to Professor Kamei. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here with us today.
I wish I were in Maui with you.
Next time.
Next time.
But just, I know you have a PowerPoint and a presentation to give, but I just wanted to, thank you so much for the book that you have written. It is so important, and it is such a resource and something that really everybody needs to have in their library. It's an amazing work. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, shall I try to share my screen now? Okay.
Yes, please do.
Okay, let's see. Great. Well, aloha, and thank you so much for this very kind invitation and the warm welcome. I am completely honored to be in the company of the Nisei Veteran Ohana. Every single one of the Japanese American men and women who served in the military in any capacity during World War II are true heroes to me, and I acknowledge their service with the deepest of gratitude. And we'll talk a little bit about them. As Deidre mentioned, and for those of you that might have had the occasion already to read my book, the story of the incarceration is a very personal one to me. It's part of my family history. But it's a history that I have had to work hard to understand over the process of many years to uncover and learn about it myself. So I appreciate this opportunity to share some of these discoveries with you. let me start by telling you something that happened to me when I was in high school. One afternoon, I was over at a classmate's house. She was celebrating her 16th birthday. And by tradition in her family, her mother gave her a hope chest, some place to keep her keepsakes. And this concept intrigued me, and I thought of my grandfather's trunk, my mother's father's trunk that was gathering dust in a shelf in my parents' garage. It had leather handles and metal clasps, and it looked like it could come from the Titanic movie. And I asked my mother if I could use that trunk in my bedroom. And I remember she said, "Oh, you want that old thing?" But she seemed pleased that I would want something of her father's. And she said, yes, I could take it up to my bedroom. And I cleaned it up and was happy to start to use it. And a little bit later, my mother dropped by my room and just almost casually mentioned that she and her parents had used this trunk when they, quote unquote, left for camp from Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. Later, I learned that it was May 1942, and that her father had used this trunk to store some of their belongings that they had to leave behind. And that was all she said. I think it was pretty typical for those of us who are sons, say, with parents and grandparents who are incarcerated, that they did not talk about the experience. And so it was years before I really learned what it meant to, quote unquote, leave for camp and to have to leave their belongings behind. It was also the case that I didn't know their circumstances. Let's see here, what happened? Their circumstances of what it was like for them on the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And bits and pieces over the years, I learned that my father's family, who were farmers in Orange County, on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, were working in their fields. And their landlord came out to tell them that a place called Pearl Harbor in Hawaii had been bombed by Japan, and they had better go inside. That night, 2 FBI agents came to the door of my father's home. They did not have search warrants, but they barged their way through the house and into the backyard, frightening 2 of my aunts who were bathing in the family's Japanese bathtub outside. Because he was not a community member, my grandfather was not arrested. But by nightfall, the FBI had arrested thousands of other Issei men simply because they were involved somehow in the community. Principals of Japanese language schools, leaders in social and civic organizations, martial arts teachers, Buddhist and Shinto priests, and even travel agents who did business with Japan. In most cases, the families left behind had no idea where their husbands and fathers had been taken, and in many cases would not be reunited with them for many years. What my father's family and the other Japanese American families did not know at the time was that the FBI had pre-identified the Japanese community leaders in anticipation of arresting them with the war with Japan that they knew was coming. These Issei men were arrested because they were aliens, but ironically, they and all the other Issei were precluded by law from becoming naturalized citizens, whether they intended America to be their adopted country or not. The next morning, my father sat in a school assembly at Huntington Union High School as the entire school listened to President Franklin D. Roosevelt address Congress and declare that the US was at war with Japan. Even as a 14-year-old freshman, my father knew that things were going to turn ugly. As an honor student, he ended up dropping out of school rather than deal with the animosity and expressions of hatred targeted against him and anyone else perceived to be the enemy because they shared the face of the enemy. It made no matter that he and the other children of the Issei pioneers were American-born citizens. So very quickly, the prevailing view became that due to their race, the Issei, as well as the Nisei, would be wholesale sympathizers with Japan and should be suspected as potential spies and saboteurs, disloyal to the interests of the United States. Now, so many times over the years, I've heard people say, well, you have to understand, Japan attacked us, they were the enemy. But the suspicion about persons of Japanese ancestry did not just arise because of the Pearl Harbor attack. The harsh reality is that from the very founding of our country, there's been a pattern of those already here distrusting and fearing the next wave of immigrants and trying to prevent or limit their migration here. I call this immigration NIMBYism. Now that I've gotten in, no one else should. The scapegoating, unfortunately, is often taken on the guise of needing to protect us against foreign threats, keeping out or keeping separate people on the premise that they have reason to harm us. And this immigration NIMBYism is old as our country itself. In 1798, our second president, John Adams, and his Federalist Party passed the first of a series of alien and citizen acts that restricted immigration and the ability of immigrants to become naturalized citizens. During the contentious debate in the embryonic House of Representatives, two congressmen actually came to blows on the floor of the House, as depicted in this political cartoon. And who were the suspected and hated immigrants in 1798? It was the French and the Irish. In this political cartoon of the time, the French are depicted as a five-headed monster. Subsequent waves of other European immigrants, including the Germans, later came to our eastern shores and faced discrimination that was at times intense. But these Europeans were characterized as white, as Caucasian, eligible for naturalization. It was different for the Asians who came across the Pacific. In the mid-1800s, the railroad robber barons and other captains of industry sent labor brokers to rural China to bring Chinese young men to California and other parts of the West as cheap labor. Lured by tales of California and America as the land of promise, especially during the gold rush, they mostly came from what was then called the Canton province under labor contracts as indentured workers. A step up from slaves, the indentured Chinese were willing to do unrelenting and dangerous work on the railroads in the continental West, and as I'm sure this audience knows, on the pineapple, coffee, and sugar plantations in Hawaii. They did work that others were not willing to do to earn their way out of the back-breaking labor contracts and hope for something better. Considered fit for this hazardous and demanding labor, they were, however, considered unfit for citizenship. The Yellow Peril phenomenon promoted anti-Chinese messages, and in 1882, the first Chinese Exclusion Act halted immigration from China. This ban remained in effect for 70 years. The Chinese Exclusion Act was very popular with the American public. So why do I start with the Chinese Exclusion Act? It's because this created a labor void on the mainland in agriculture, mining, fishing, and local industries, especially on the West Coast and in the intermountain areas. And again, as I'm sure you all know, on the Hawaiian plantations. So where did they go next, these labor agents? Japan. Meiji era Japan was undergoing an economic crisis, and the Japanese government and the labor brokers found it mutually advantageous to promote the US as a land of opportunity to the young men in mostly the southwestern prefectures of Fukuoka, Hiroshima, Kumamoto, and Yamaguchi. So starting in 1885, 3 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first Japanese immigrants stepped off ships that brought them to Hawaii and also Seattle and San Francisco. But these Issei immigrants also stepped into the pre-existing Yellow Peril prejudices that were held against the Chinese. And like the Chinese before them, the Japanese immigrants would also be seen as forever foreign or always alien, unacceptable and unimaginable as Americans. Whether they either satisfied the terms of their labor contracts or came directly to the mainland from Japan, they worked as crop pickers, domestics, labor mill workers, cannery workers. They saved their money, they became entrepreneurs. And in little Tokyos and Nihonmachis up and down the West Coast, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Tacoma, they opened boarding houses, hotels, shops, restaurants, nurseries, and other small enterprises. I'd like to introduce you to my maternal grandmother, Shizu Kamei, in the middle, with her father, Tomeguso Kamei, and her stepmother, Haruyo. My great-grandfather, Tomeguso, and his brother, Haramatsu, left Wakayama, Japan for Kealia, Kauai, to work on the sugarcane plantation there. My great-granduncle stayed in Kauai, and my great-grandfather came to the mainland. Once here in Southern California, he had his daughter, my grandmother, leave Japan to come join him here. My dad's grandparents and parents were part of what was an extensive and vibrant Japanese American agricultural community. The Issei from the rural parts of Japan brought with them expertise in farming and became particularly successful farmers through their savvy agricultural practices and industriousness. By the turn of the century, the Issei farmers in California were outproducing all other farmers in the state on a per acre basis. My dad's family grew strawberries, tomatoes, sugar beets, and other vegetables, and they were especially known for their celery. By the advent of World War I, the cards were starting to get stacked against all persons of Japanese ancestry in both generations. US foreign relations with Japan had become tense, with Japan becoming an increasingly militarily aggressive country, and fears and suspicions with geopolitical origins started to carry over to the people of the same national origin. White labor unions used wedge politics to marshal anti-Japanese sentiment to their cause of eliminating the Japanese as economic competitors. The 1924 Immigration Act shut down any further immigration from Japan, a ban that would last until the 1952 Walter McCarran Immigration and Nationalities Act. Groups such as the Native Sons and Daughters of the Golden West wanted to keep this country, quote unquote, white. The Yellow Peril propaganda reemerged, reinforcing prevailing notions of white supremacy. The so-called nativists were both appalled and affronted that the Nisei, who had birthright citizenship, would be citizens, and considered it a sham that immigrants whom they didn't consider to be worthy of citizenship could have children born here who were thereby citizens. A powerful agribusiness lobby capitalized on all of these political forces to enact alien land laws in the Western states that prevented the Japanese from owning land or holding long-term leases. With Japan declared as a wartime enemy, the nativists and the agribusiness lobbies had the golden opportunity that they wanted to remove those they considered un-American and position them as economic competition. In short, it simply wasn't a matter of wartime hysteria that led to the political pressures to forcibly remove and detain persons who shared the same ancestry of what was now a wartime enemy. As you probably know, most Nisei were children, teenagers, and young adults on the West Coast in 1942. For the most part, had no connections really with Japan, had never been. They didn't even speak Japanese all that well. But nevertheless, to avoid acknowledging that the Nisei had rights as American citizens, our government referred to them as non-aliens, an invented euphemistic term. It was only about 10 weeks from the date of the Pearl Harbor attack to the date upon which President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, February 19, 1942. It's stunning to me that in this short amount of time, the political will had snowballed to support the forced removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. The Department of Justice and its agency head, the Attorney General, had caved on any objections, constitutional and otherwise. I once asked my mother why they went along with something that seemed so ridiculous. And what I didn't realize is that Congress had made it a crime to not comply with the military orders. Most felt they had no choice but to obey. I also get asked why the Japanese in Hawaii were not similarly subjected to mass exclusion. There's so much one could say about this, and I devote an entire class in my USC course and some coverage in my book to the many distinctions and suppositions as to what happened and what didn't happen. But just to cover this briefly, first and foremost, Joseph Poindexter, the governor of the territory of Hawaii, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, declared martial law throughout the territory and suspended the writ of habeas corpus. 10 days later, Major General Walter C. Short, who had been the military commander responsible for the defense of the US military installations in Hawaii, was replaced by this general, Lieutenant General Dulles Emmons. And according to some historians, General Emmons played a key role in the fate of what happened or didn't happen to the Japanese Americans in Hawaii. Despite the hardships upon the entire population due to the ramifications of martial law, the declaration of martial law probably helped avoid a mass evacuation from there. Instead, General Emmons selectively detained less than 2,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. They and their families ended up in various Department of Justice alien detention facilities, as well as the War Relocation Authority camps. And without diminishing the hardship and tragedy inflicted upon these families, they constituted less than 1% of the Japanese American Hawaii population at the time. When various proposals started circulating in Washington, D.C., that the Japanese in Hawaii should likewise be removed en masse, General Emmons stalled and ultimately frustrated any such plans. He challenged the allegation of Navy Secretary Frank Knotts that Japanese American sabotage had contributed to the Pearl Harbor attack. He argued that removing more than 35% of the population of Hawaii would have been a logistical nightmare and an unsupportable use of precious military personnel and supplies, including ships. He also argued that the Japanese labor was critical to both the civilian and military economics of the islands. How different history might have been if the Western Defense Command, with military jurisdiction over the West Coast, had had someone in charge with the sentiments and the rationale of General Emmons, instead of Lieutenant General John DeWitt, who had a deeply rooted prejudice against Japanese persons and was almost fanatical about wanting to remove the Japanese from his jurisdiction. Something I didn't know from my parents is that when they received the military exclusion orders, they didn't know where they were being sent or how long they would be away, or even if they would ever return. You probably know how they had to sell or close their businesses, although their bank accounts were frozen. My father's family had to leave standing several acres of celery ready to harvest. Trunks such as my grandfather's were stored with sympathetic friends or in local churches and temples. What they didn't sell at a fraction of the worth to scavengers they had to abandon. They never recovered from the loss of their life efforts and savings after this point. My mother and her parents were among those who boarded buses in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo, here in front of what is then the Nishihonganji Temple, and now part of the Japanese American National Museum. Others had less civilized transportation. From the moment they arrived at the departure points to board buses and trains to the assembly centers, they were surrounded by lines of soldiers with guns and fixed bayonets. Photos were not allowed to show the soldiers pointing their guns and bayonets at them, but there are many, many first-hand accounts telling of this. Yet the media made it seem that they went willingly, even happily. The San Francisco News reported that most of the evacuees seemed to feel they were going on a picnic. When they arrived at the assembly centers, they were shocked to find that they were surrounded by barbed wire, 24-hour armed guards, and towers with searchlights. They soon learned they would be subjected to unannounced searches in their barracks and twice daily roll calls. I think this audience is probably familiar with the inhumane conditions, first in the assembly centers, in which many incarcerees were placed in horse stalls at the Santa Anita and Tanforan racetracks, and in livestock pens and facilities that were converted from fairgrounds. And later in the 10 War Relocation Authority detention facilities, which we know as the camps, the stories are endless of how they endured extreme weather without proper clothing, inedible food, limited supplies of hot water, sporadically functioning toilets and showers without partitions. And how the overcrowded living quarters lacked any privacy. And one story that I felt propelled to include in my book as I discovered it in my research was how one Issei mother had remained so stoic throughout the whole removal ordeal until she was directed to stuff straw into the sacks for her family's mattresses. And it was at this moment that the Issei mother started to cry in front of her teenage daughter. And the daughter remembered that this was literally the last straw in her mother's brave facade. I did not have any family members who served in the military, the 442nd or 100th or MIS. So my first chance to learn about their stories was when I was working on the redress campaign, when I got to meet and know some of the veterans to hear of their experiences. And my hope and goal is that everyone would know about the service record of the Nisei soldiers. My day job here at USC is to be the managing director of something called the Spatial Sciences Institute. And in this capacity, I work with many veterans and active military of high rank in various defense agencies and organizations, because one of our specialties is human security and geospatial intelligence. And I tell you because I wanted to share this one story that I had. At a conference, I was included at a VIP dinner in New York, and I was seated next to a 4-star Navy admiral who was then the director of one of our country's major defense intelligence agencies. And because there were a lot of us smashed into a little corner of this small New York restaurant, he was pretty much stuck talking with me the entire evening. And it was a rare opportunity for me to get to know someone so distinguished. I was able to tell him about the course that I teach, the book that was then underway, my family connections to the incarceration. And I want you to know that he knew very well about the 100th, the 442nd, and the MIS. And he said it didn't matter what branch of service, whether it was Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, that everyone in military leadership knows about the example and record of the Nisei soldiers. I was able to give him some additional stories and context. And this admiral said he would remember those stories and would tell them when he is called upon to give motivational, inspirational remarks to his troops. One aspect myself that I did not understand, coming from the mainland, and that this admiral also was not familiar with, was that not all of the Nisei soldiers were volunteers. I think so much is made, rightly so, of, for instance, Senator Danny Noe and others rushing to volunteer, this send-off at Iolani Palace, and then later Mike Masaoka being the first to volunteer in a general's office in Washington, D.C. And remarkably, about 800 did volunteer from inside the camps. Here is Howard Uno at Amachi being fingerprinted by an Army sergeant as part of his enlisting process. And what really touches me is that Howard left behind a wife and a baby in camp. But this number fell far below the expectations that the Army had that thousands would volunteer from the camps, and that the rest who did serve did so because they were drafted. The ultimate irony of being compelled to serve at the risk of death for a country that imprisoned them because they could not trust their loyalty. The so-called loyalty questionnaire was the cause of perhaps the most divisive aspect of the incarceration. And in short, the purposes of a questionnaire to determine an incarcerate's loyalty to support granting them clearance to leave for a job or for some other purpose got conflated with the military's purposes of determining loyalty to serve in the military. The poor wording and the government's collective tone deafness caused so much confusion and heartache that have ramifications that have endured to today. So 2 questions have become particularly infamous. Question 27 asked, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And question number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any allegiance, any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Approximately 22% of the Nisei male respondents answered no to these 2 questions for a variety of reasons. They became known as the no-no boys, and they and their families were sent to Tule Lake, which was turned into a high-security prison. The so-called no-no boys are to be distinguished from those who might have answered yes on the loyalty questionnaire, but who later refused to report for their physicals that were required to report for the draft. Their premise was that they weren't willing to serve, but would only do so once they and their families were recognized as American citizens and released from camp, restored to a non-prison status. The largest group of the draft resistors were these 63 young men at Hart Mountain who were sentenced for failing to comply with the selective service requirements. These different perspectives and the actions that these individuals took to follow through on their principles divided families and the community then. And I know that hard feelings continue to run deep even today. My approach in teaching and talking about the examples of the no-no boys, the draft resistors, and others who fought in other ways, such as Minya Sui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Fred Korematsu, who engaged in judicial resistance, is not to take away anything from the contributions of those who served so valiantly, but rather to share that the Japanese American community, then and now, is not monolithic, and that there were different ways in which those who had to face and deal with aspects of the incarceration handled them according to their own circumstances. Now, I personally feel that there would not have been redress without the sacrifice and records of the Nisei soldiers. I became involved in the redress campaign because of my father's involvement in the Japanese American community here in Southern California. And in the mid-1970s, my father was among those who had experienced the incarceration as a Nisei teenager. And some sansei older than I, that were very politically engaged, who sought to bring attention to this episode and to have the government acknowledge that its wartime actions were wrong. Due to Michi Wakeland, Aiko Hirsuke Yoshinaga, and others who conducted just astonishing research, had it covered literally hundreds of thousands of documents to prove that in the National Archives, to prove that the government never had a rationale of military necessity, then it knew it didn't. It told lies to cover this up. And this included to presentations in briefs and in oral arguments to the Supreme Court. I was in college at the time, and my dad one day opened up to me about some of the challenges that he and his family faced after they returned to Orange County after they were released from Poston. Having lost everything, they were destitute, but started over in vegetable gardening and vegetable farming. And it was the first time that I started to realize that their problems and their traumas and their challenges didn't end when they got out of camp. And if anything, it became even harder on them. As I became involved in redress, my father and I became something of a media 1-2 punch. Students laugh at my hair, and you can laugh too. He and the other Nisei who were incarcerated, he was an example of someone who overcame all odds to live the American dream, who still believed in this country, but wanted the record to be set straight. And I then, as an attorney, wanted the constitutional wrong to be righted. And here we are being interviewed by CNN on August 6, 1988, to explain the significance that President Reagan was about to sign H.R. 442, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided an apology to the surviving incarcerees and token payments as a part of our country's only large-scale reparations program to date. You've perhaps seen this photo. The White House sent me one afterwards. In his remarks, at the White House signing ceremony, President Reagan referenced his role in recognizing the bravery of Kazuo Masuda of the 442nd, killed in action in Italy. I hope you might read in my book about the redress contributions of Rudy Tokiwa, a friend of my father's, grievously injured in the Lost Battalion rescue, who single-handedly turned around the opposition of a key Florida congressman and delivered 4 yay votes for H.R. 442 that we would not have otherwise had. It's really a remarkable story. And I hope that many of you have already read Daniel James Brown's book, Facing the Mountain, in which Rudy figures prominently. For as much as we should rightfully celebrate the accomplishment of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, let me tell you what the legislation does not do. It does not address that in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the incarceration on this military necessity basis. While Korematsu and the other so-called wartime internment Supreme Court cases have been discredited, those cases have never been expressly overturned. And in fact, in its 2018 decision in Trump versus Hawaii, known as the travel ban decision, the Supreme Court followed the same logic of the Korematsu Court in accepting without inquiry the executive branch's assertion of national security as constitutional justification for an acknowledged infringement of civil liberties of individuals on the basis of national origin and religion. Now, I hear from those that say, war is hell, everyone suffers, let it lie and move on. And they challenge why we should care about this episode in our nation's past, 80 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the issuance of Executive Order 9066. And I believe we should care because there are those who cite the Japanese American Incarceration as justification for doing it again, simply because it was done before. In September 2018, Los Angeles City Council member David Brew held an event in Sherman Oaks to talk with his constituents about possible homeless shelter and housing sites in his district. One attendee stood up to say that the federal government should just move the homeless out of urban areas. And this person cited the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans as an example of how the government has removed quote unquote undesirables before. And since the government has done it before, why couldn't it just do that again? We saw history repeating itself after 9/11. Today, we see families separated at the border and in other locations. We see children in detention facilities without adequate education or healthcare. We see echoes of the past repeated today, again and again. Not long after Russia's attack on Ukraine began, and we all started to see images of Ukrainians leaving behind their homes with only what they could carry. One of my best friends who was Ukrainian said to me she remembered me showing this photo on the left of the community being forcibly removed from Bainbridge Island, Washington, with only what they could carry. And she said she had new appreciation for what that must have meant in 1942 and what it now means in 2022. As part of my research, I examined in the War Relocation Authority records the individual records for my incarcerated family members in Washington, D.C. And in them, I was fortunate enough to find some real treasures. A photo of my father at about the age 15 or 16, I think. I was grieved to learn in their medical records of my grandparents' poor health, made much worse by the harsh camp environment. I was truly angered to read comments about the personalities included in sociological assessments that they most likely had no idea were being made. And do you remember that trunk of my grandfather's? I was amazed to find the receipt issued to my grandfather when he retrieved his trunk from storage upon his return to Los Angeles in February 1946. This trunk now sits in my living room, an ever-present reminder of my family's wartime experience. The story of my grandfather's trunk is just one that could be told of about the 120,000 incarcerated persons whose legacies have been cloaked by emotion and obscured by the passage of time. And yet, sometimes their messages are hiding in plain sight. In my book, I quote the philosopher and poet George Santana, who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I would add the corollary, those who don't know our past will find a way to reinvent it. I so appreciate the chance to being able to share some of these stories with you today, and hope you will join me in continuing to share the stories about the incarceration so that people understand that it happened to real people, that they suffered and continues to be real consequences, and that these stories might help us work toward ensuring that something like this would never happen again. So thank you so much. Mahalo and aloha.
Thank you so much. What a powerful talk and presentation. We are going to open it up for questions, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first few. So many things I want to talk about, and so many things we did talk about before today's Zoom. But about the book, let's start with the book. And you have the stories, you have voices talking throughout the book. And can you share with us how you categorize those voices. Why are they put in the way that they are?
Thank you. Well, there's so many to choose from. And it was a function of trying to show at as many points as possible what the personal experience was from the perspective of those who were old enough to be able to talk about it. And unfortunately, it has become mostly a Nisei story because the Issei speaking mostly Japanese, and we have just that fewer amount of records to draw from. My hope was in terms of clustering or having a string of quotes together also was to show that in almost all cases there were differences of opinion, there were differences of perspective, and again to try to foster the understanding that there were so many individual decisions and that there was no one reaction.
And also the title of the book itself. Can you share where that came from?
Yeah, so this is a story that we don't know for sure if it's actually true or not, but it had circulated among the camps, and it was often told and repeated. In some cases, it's about a little boy. In some cases, it was a little girl. I chose to make her a little girl, and it was something that my parents had mentioned how it was a shock to go from their communities and where they were a racial minority to first the assembly center, or in my father's case, they went directly to the post as a WWII camp. And what a shock it was to then be in an environment where everybody was Japanese. And so it was part of this phenomenon that this story comes out that a child one day has assumed that her parents have taken her to Japan because now she's suddenly surrounded by all these Japanese faces. And she says something along the lines of, I don't like it here. Mommy, I want to go home. When can we go back to America? And for the Nisei who were relaying the story, it had taken on the significance, this larger principled metaphoric significance that, well, we're American, and what happened to the country that should have recognized us as being American? So when can we go back to a country that recognizes us as a citizen?
And I think to that point, was it George Takei who said in his quote that truly this was all a terrible failure of American ideals. If we're all supposed to be equal and free, how awful this was, a terrible failure.
So it was something that I held my breath a little bit with in the editorial process about the bios, and there was my main editor that was not familiar with the story and was learning, and just found the amount of detail. In some cases, for some had lots of details because of what was published about them or had histories from their families, and others were very, very sparse. So the lengths of the bios were different. And I kept expecting that in the editorial process, they were going to tell me to cut everything down to a standard size, or it was wasn't going to be room to print such in some cases lengthy bios. And I was holding my breath. I was really pleased that 201, as it was going through different levels of editors, that they found the detail to be really compelling and that they found the detail to be really important. So to the extent that it had been assembled, to be able to give context for the reader as to who this person was and what their life was like. And the quote might have been just a sentence, but to be able to understand who that person was. So I thought that was I think that was a real bonus, a real accomplishment that we were able to do. I really give credit to Simon and Schuster for their open-mindedness in wanting to have people be able to read about the individuals whose voices that we hear.
And you have so many voices in the book. I know that I'm sure you don't have everybody's voice. How were you able to sift through and pick them? And how long did it take you to do this journey? And my gosh, it must have just been so emotional to do this book.
Yeah, and there are many that could have been included. Every now and then I come across something and this has this has to go in. It was just trying to with all these different angles, and it was just really easy to go down different rabbit holes. For as comprehensive as I was hoping that it would be, there still had to be, still had to have a storyline, right? Still have a focus in terms of not losing people in the thread of the narrative. And so it was mostly, I had an eye towards if somebody were in the room with us, and how would they have told the story, and to plug in different voices accordingly. And most of the quotes were from material that had been captured 30, 40 years ago, testimonies before the Congressional Commission that were both orally given and transcribed, or in the case of the Los Angeles hearings, had been videoed and transcribed. Articles of Nisei in particular at various stages of their life as they received honors or had been recognized in the community. And then to the extent that in some cases able to contact family members, in some cases folks that were still living.
I definitely want to talk about how it felt to work on such a life-changing event as Redress with your father.
Oh, thank you.
But before we do that, I was wondering if there's anything from the book that stands out to you, or that you would like to share with the audience today. The whole book stands out, of course. I don't know how you could pick one thing over another, but is there anything you'd like to read from the book?
Oh gosh. There's speaking of my father, maybe I'll
okay, combine the two.
I'll combine the two. Okay, so I'll tell a little backstory on the process of being invited to the White House signing ceremony. So it coincided with, it was a very last minute. We did not know that President Reagan was actually, once we knew he was going to sign the bill, we did not know that he was going to actually have a ceremony. And so it was something of a last minute decision that got relayed that he would have a signing ceremony. And it was coinciding with the conclusion of the National JCL convention that was taking place in Seattle. And so there were a lot of folks that in the perfect world would have been there, but decided for responsibilities in JCL or other plans that they had made or whatever, and that they wouldn't be able to swing it. And so there were those that were in charge of assembling the list, and we're just going down the list and calling people the days before cell phones and things like that. And I got a call that said, "You're on the list. And the FBI is going to do a background check. And as soon as the FBI clears you from the background check, then they'll call you back and tell you you're a go. And then and by this point, it would be the red eye, to get there the next day sort of thing. So they said, don't go anywhere, sit by your phone." And so I got a call and said, "You're a go." And they also said, "Your father's on the list, but he's down lower." Now, and everybody that I tell this story to that was involved in Redress says, and I agree that was so wrong. My dad should have been higher on the list than I was. Okay, but be that as it may, I'm actually at my parents' home, and got the call, and my dad, and so this is a very Japanese thing. My dad says, "You go. I don't know whether I'm going to get called or not. You don't wait for me. You just make your plans and you go ahead and go." And I'm saying, "No, I'm not going to go without you. I'm going to wait because, you might get called too." And he goes, "No, no, 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 no." So we're having this argument, right? So I called back my friend who had called me, and I told him what's going on. I said, "My dad wants me to go. Don't want to go without him. You get it." And he goes, "I'll call you back." Click. Okay. Calls me back. He says, "You can bring a guest." So we made our plans. So we're in. So this is what's in the book. And one of my editor friends, who's not involved in the book, when he read this, he said, "I noticed the purposeful use of the passive voice." And so the one story I tell about about the morning of the signing ceremony, and those of us from the Salonico chapter in the JCL. I don't know how we did this without cell phones, but we all managed to know that to meet at a particular coffee shop, and we were biding our time before Norm Mineta had thrown a breakfast for us, and we're waiting in this coffee shop, and I asked my father. The purposeful use of the passive voices in the book, he was asked, but I asked my father what it was like for him to be an invited guest to the White House to hear a president of the United States apologize when on the morning of Pearl Harbor, he felt that he'd already told me he had felt that the world had forever changed, it would never be the same. And how he couldn't answer. He was just so overcome, and he just looked into the distance, and his eyes filled with tears. And so it was just that kind of moment to be able to try to put myself in the shoes of those who'd been incarcerated to live to see that day.
It must have been so overwhelming, so emotional, but also just being able to work on this, with your father. I mean, how many children and parents get that opportunity to work together and to work on something so huge, and how it must have also just affected your whole family.
It is, and I have 3 brothers, and I think that is something special that I was able to share with my dad. And when I got when I got the advanced review copy, and was able to show my mother that my editor, my mother's now 94, and we were good, holding our breath that she'd be able to celebrate the book, and the editors were really concerned, how quickly was I going to take it to her. She lives about an hour and a half away in the Newport Beach area, and so I think being able to show her and recognize so many names in the book has been very nice.
So, I mean, the book is so comprehensive, and for those who haven't read it yet, it starts before Pearl Harbor. It goes through what happened. It talks about the internment, the incarceration. It talks about the 100th, the 442, the MIS, the reparations. But it's such an important book, and you have an amazing glossary in there as well. And it's really there are these stories of resilience and humanity, but it's also a wonderful resource guide for anybody who is interested in learning this story. And how are you really able to balance it all? Because it could have been just a completely historic novel. It could have been a research guide. How were you able to combine it all to make it what it is?
Most of it, I had the material and the research I had assembled for my USC course, and the then in the process of writing the narrative and as it went through the editor's review, they who are not familiar with the material and with the community were the ones that said, well, we're running across all these words in Japanese or, the terms of art like habeas corpus. And so it was, we're going to need a glossary. And then, a timeline, to be able to keep things sorted in terms of what was happening, both in terms of US history, but also world history. So one thing just kind of led to another in terms of wanting it to be a resource for students, for other researchers. The material is out there, but it's just very hard to know how to get to it. Things are in the congressional record, but you have to be able to dig through the congressional record. Things are, amazing resources that Densho and the Japanese American National Museum and other organizations have made available. But I did know from pulling together the materials from my course that there wasn't any one place that tied the stories together. There's an amazing amount of scholarship that's been done by very distinguished faculty, and it tends to be on particular slices. So the work on, the analysis of the Supreme Court cases, or the role of the Nisei military, or the sociological, anthropological experiences in camp. There's books that are now starting to come out relatively recently on aspects such as the Draftford sisters, Eric Muller's research. And so there's a lot more that's out there, but there wasn't any one place that did pull it all together. And I recognized that was something that readers of not just of World War II history, but anyone that might be motivated to learn about the episode, to try to put it into a non-academic context, make it relatable. And so that's where the idea of being personal and introducing people to what really happened by real people became very important.
So you published this book during COVID. How was that? How has that been? I had from the time I got the go, produce a manuscript. That was July 2019, and for lots of reasons that were internal to Simon & Schuster, they wanted it right away. They wanted the manuscript right away. I turned it in actually in January. My academic colleagues hate to hear this. I actually turned it in January 2020, and then was starting to work on the back matter, the resources. Was trying to finish pulling together the biographies, and then everything shut down, everything shut down, and including everything in New York related to publishing. And I heard nothing from anybody until about April 2020, and then it just started with the editorial and production process. It got delayed. Everything got delayed. So the release date got delayed to September 7th this past year, 2021. Things were still virtual, and events and the whole publishing distribution has still been dramatically affected. So the good thing about this book is that it's also meant, in addition to the general readership, to be in libraries and on school curricula, and I'm hearing about it showing up in local libraries and school teachers using it. Well, it's such an important book, and it's been really lovely having chats with you ahead of today's call, and you've just been so gracious and very personal, and kind of putting yourself out there, and it's just been really, really nice. I'm going to come back to you for some closing remarks, but want to thank everybody for joining us today. We thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. If you are interested in future Zoom programming and in-person programs here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, please visit our website at nvnc.org. We are constantly updating things, and we just love to have your participation. But I'll turn it back over to you, Susan, for final remarks, and just a big thank you again for all of your work on this and for doing this for the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center.
Well, I would just like to thank you all for the opportunity, and I appreciate your interest in caring about the topic, and I would love to hear from you. If you had any other ideas or questions, my website is susanhkamei.com, and there's a way to say hello if you might be interested. And I just love to come visit someday.
We would love to have that. We just created a new space. It's the Stanley Izumigawa Resource Center. We have had a couple of book signings and book talks. So the next time your family is over here on Maui, definitely, we would love to have you here. And we're looking forward to it. So thank you for writing this book for about a time in our history that should never be forgotten, never be repeated. You did such a beautiful, emotional job of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.